Hello again, midwinter season and another story. This one is my own telling of a song you may well know, one I love and used to love to sing when I had a voice that was worth listening to. Thomas the Rhymer is the song, and many people have sung it very, very well. And this is not a song, this is the tale as I see it might have happened. So, here we go into the Rhymer's tale. Rain smeared the green glass before his eyes. It had been so all day. He'd come home from the fountain with rain pouring off the eaves of his hat into the funnel of his coat collar. He was still wet behind the ears despite the dry blanket now wrapped about him. Somehow, he couldn't keep his eyes from the window. But he had poured the water onto the green stone just as the old man had said he would. And now he waited. The horse was weary now, the spring gone out of his delicate hooves. A day and a night in this lonely place took the heart out of him. But his lady clucked to him, chucking the reins gently and allowing a little of the energy she stored to slide into him. He tossed his head bravely, shaking the raindrops over her face, and the cold water refreshed her as the mortal miles clip-clopped gently on beneath her. Tom turned away from the window to mend the fire. His clothes steamed from the line strung across the mantel. The logs coughed fitfully in the damp air, hissing now and then as the water dripped from the sleeves of his shirt. Tom coughed too, a thin man with little fat on him to ward off the winter chill, and it had been winter now for a very long time. Tom poked the logs into a spurt of fire. The flames scorched the hem of his trousers. He hadn't been along that pathway since boyhood, but now the old man had died. Tom's promise had been called out of him again. Sitting now, watching the flames, he saw the green wood path before his eyes again, felt the leather thongs bite into his shoulders as he had pulled the roan sled along the frozen ground. Big though he'd been in life, in death, the old one had been of little weight. Tom pulled the sled easily, and when he had finally got there, what had he actually seen? The fountain still rose up out of the green pool. Icicles fringed its edges like a silver shawl, and the battered metal cup still hung from its chain. Nothing, it seemed, had changed. He hadn't wanted to do it, really. So he'd sat for a long time beside the green pool while his backside slowly froze into the mud, his mind leagues and years away. And then he felt the presence again. The eyes, like stars, had shone out at him through the leafless branches. Stuck fast in the frozen mud, Tom couldn't move, so he waited, turning his head this way and that as they drew nearer and nearer. The fur was warm when finally it touched him, and the wolf's breath was sweet as apples. Noses snuffled all round his haunches, freeing him from the ice. Very, very slowly he stood upright. Bright dark eyes regarded him. Grey paws circled round him. White steamy breath spun upwards, and the yellow teeth shone out from the red jaws. Tom stood transfixed. The old one lay lightly atop the roan sled, and three of the largest grey ones took hold of the leather thongs in their mouths and began to pull the sled deeper into the forest. The others stood about Tom, but he had no intention of moving. When the last sound of the rustling snow faded from his ears, the oldest grey one stood, putting his paws on Tom's shoulders. The warm tongue rasped against his cheeks. The tip of it stroked his eyelids. From somewhere, a voice came into his mind, silvery-like and singing. Wait yourself, mortal man, through a year and a day. Wait yourself and come not here again. Wait yourself until the birds call. Then come again and wash the stone for us. Wash the stone in the water of the fountain. Tom found himself alone again, blinking into the last shreds of sunlight as they filtered through the branches. He shivered himself awake, rubbing his hands together and blowing on his fingers. Then he looked for the sled. Gone it was. When he looked down, he saw the snow all trapped about with prints, wolf spoor. Beside his hand, a few strands of silver fur had caught the last bramble thorns. A voice seemed to whisper out of the tree branches. Don't you forget now, Tom. A year and a day 'twill be, and you come here again. Don't you forget now, Tom. He stood a while until the shadows darkened the path, then walked slowly home. Nearer now, she thought to herself, clucking again to the horse. It took all the energy she could store to make her way across this land, but the horse would do it. He knew the way, had made the journey many times before. Softly he whickered to her as she stroked the wet silk of his mane. Tom's clothes steamed merrily and the fire sputtered its protest. It felt as if the mists of the forest were rising up in his small cottage. He pushed his trousers to one side and pulled the kettle on its chain over to the hottest part of the fire. He needed something warm, something to warm him from the inside. Then he turned back to the window while he waited for it to boil. Something white glimmered through the streams of rain pouring down his window pane. He wiped at the inside of the steamy glass. Yes, there was something there, flickering in and out between the stems of the trees. It looked like a horse. With his nose pressed against the glass, Tom watched it come on, closer and closer. There was no mistaking it. A white horse came out of the edge of the forest. There was a woman on his back, tall and straight, the rain seeming to slide off her silver cloak and her golden hair. Tom forgot to breathe. Clippity-clop she came, clippity-clop across the clearing. Despite the darkness of the night, a light seemed to shine out of her, and the rain burned with a silver light. Bright she came, riding up to the door of his cottage. Tom backed away from the window. Three times the knock sounded on the oak that bounded him within the cottage walls. And again, knock, knock, knock. And three times more. The door creaked a little and swung open of its own accord, unable to resist. Tom shivered where he stood. The lady stood in the doorway, rain streaming down her, the horse's muzzle on her shoulder. Tom reached in his brown curls but found no hat to doff. He pulled the blanket close around him and bowed down on one knee. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Come in," he whispered. coming out of the rain. And he stumbled forward, tripping on the blanket, dropping it, standing before her as naked as a newborn babe. The horse followed her over the threshold, and not a drop of moisture came in with them. Both horse and lady were dry and fresh as a summer meadow. And the kettle began to whistle, Tom to blush, and the lady to laugh gently as she touched his arm. "'Tis goodly to see a man again," she said. Her dark eyes ran up and down the length of him. It felt like butterfly wings touching his flesh. She drew him down to his own hearthside and sat watching while he brewed the tisane. He sat at her feet. He sat at her feet the night long as they sipped the warm honey water. Drip, drip, drip. He could hear it now. There were spaces between the dripping of the water. Sunlight glowed wetly through the glass. The embers were hidden in the soft grey ash, soft and grey as a wolf's fur. Sitting straighter, he turned to face her. Her dark eyes shone down on him. "Come and go," she whispered softly. "Come along with me, Thomas." And her breath was sweet as she licked the night sleep from out his eyes. Tom struggled into his dry clothes. They were stiff now, dried hard in the heat of the fire. The trousers scraped his leg as he pulled them on. Boots, hat and cloak. He followed her out the cottage door. His hands nearly met as he slipped them round her waist to lift her onto the horse's back. And she reached down a hand to help him mount behind her, then turned the milk-white steed to face again into the forest. Tom never did look back. They rode on and on through the darkling trees, the wet dripping never touching them, the red mud never spattering the white hide. The sun set and rose and set again around them before they cleared the edge of the forest. In the last light of day, they came out from the canopy of branches into a land Tom could never have imagined. Brown and hard it seemed in the last of the light, like rock that had been pulverized by a millstone. Nothing grew here. As the light leached away, he could no longer tell where earth met sky. Only the crunching sound of the hooves assured him there was any land left at all. He could feel the lady pressed against his body, but nothing could he see. They rode and rode and rode. Tom had no way of knowing time. His mouth burned and his heart ached. The horse's breath rasped in time with a rustle of sand about his feet. Sometime he could feel a tingling current flow into his veins as the lady touched his hand. Sometimes he could feel it flowing through the body of the horse between his legs. And still they rode, neither moon nor sun in the sky to light their way. Gradually, another sound came into Tom's ears. It seemed a heavy, rhythmic, roaring sound, like some great animal sleeping. Louder it came as they rode into the darkness. Soon Tom couldn't hear the sound of the horse at all. And then the darkness began to change. There seemed to be a silvering of the air about him and about Tom, and Tom could see the horse's ears, darker shadows against the pewter sky. There was a line again, where earth met sky. But there was something else too. Some part of the land between him and the horizon seemed to move, flickering, shimmering. As the light grew, Tom saw the skin of the world heave and ripple like the skin of some animal when a fly lights upon it. Tom sucked in his breath. The roaring sound pulsed in time with the ripples. "'Tis the sea, Tom," she said. "Water, salt, and it goes as far as the eye can see." "It goes on forever," he breathed. "Nay, Tom, but it goes a long, long way." And as she spoke, the moon rose out of the sea and shone its silvery pathway to their feet. "Dost see then? Dost see yon bonny, bonny road?" And she was pointing down at the pathway of light, flattening out the waves and leading from the shore at their feet to the horizon. "That road lies across the burning brine." Tom nodded his head. "That is the road to fair Elfland," she said. "The road that you and I this night must go." And she clucked again to the horse, shaking the reins gently. Tom watched, unbelieving, as the horse set one delicate hoof after the other on the shining moon path, and the light held them. They did not sink into the foamy brine. The light flattened the path before them, and they rode on, easier now than all the days or nights in the desert waste. Tom's body swung softly to the easy rhythm of the horse's steps. His mind dreamed, hanging there in the crystal light, walking on water in the brilliant shadows of the full moon. The journey seemed one long, endless night. In his heart, he knew where she was taking him. Hadn't the old man told him often enough? Had he ever truly believed? He conjured up the memory, the firelight, the flickering flames, the hissing applewood, the scent of mugwort and lavender thrown onto the glowing embers, and a cup of hot honey water warming his fingers. And the old man's voice, clear and melodious like a great bell brushed softly with a feather stick. The rhythm of the voice had swung him along like the step of the horse. "After the rains come," he would say, "that's when it'll be. And thou'll go out in the darkness before the first star, walk the forest path until they come to the fountain. Thou knowest the cup. Taken, Tom lad, taken and pour the water on the stone. There'll be great adventures for ye." And he would chuckle as he fell asleep. Tom had no memory of how he'd come to the cottage in the forest. The old one told the tale of how the sorrowing woman had come with a baby, the baby Thomas, snug in her arms, and left him there on the step. But Tom was happy in the cottage, the clearing, the forest. The animals knew him. The trees would move a branch for him as he passed, and always willingly drop firewood. Bees made honey in the hollow trees. Foxes would leave a rabbit on the doorstep now and then, and the herbs grew in profusion. The old man had given him books and cooking, geometry and weaving. He had shown Tom how to let the garden grow itself. And he had told the stories, sitting there in the firelight on a winter's eve, or in the bat-haunted warmth of summer under the trees. Tales of how the land lived, the fair folk, the selkies of the sea, and the Sealy Court. Tom had loved those tales. Folk dressed in silken spider weavings, riding milk-white horses with the dark light shining out behind their eyes. When I die, the old man had said, when I'm gone and there's naught left but the husk of me, then the winter will come. 'Twill come and all before that. When I die, he said, when I'm gone and there's naught but the husk of me left, then the winter will come. 'Twill come and all before that, even as I sink, and thee must bear it for me. Take me outside, he'd said. Build a sled of rowan wood and cross the staves with hazel twigs and bind the wolf skin on my bed across them all. He'd been pottering about as he talked, putting up the honeycombs to drain into the earthenware bowls. Tom had felt a chill cross over his heart. You'll have to tie me on, but I won't be no weight for you to pull, and the snow will be down to help you slide the sled. He turned to look at Tom's diminutive frame. Ah, but you'll do it. Tom had nodded. His throat was too full to answer. The old man had tapped him lightly on the shoulder. Ah, I know he'll do it. Sitting by the fire together around the longest night of the year, he told of the wolves. It won't be this year, no, but I'm thinking it may be next. I can feel them calling to me now. Stronger it gets as the light shrinks. They call me in my bones, lad. My time is nearly done, and soon it will be for you to carry on. And don't you be afraid of them, lad, he said. They won't harm me. They do come for me, and you must let them take me. You'll go back home then, keep my fire burning for a year through the darkest winter. Tom had wondered about that winter. They had winter every year. Snow bright with robins, icicles making music as they hung from tree branches, frost stars on the window. He loved the winter. But how the old man spoke of it now, it sounded dark. The words themselves carried a cold that pierced his bones. This was a winter Tom had never known. And then, he'd said, the old man, and then the birds will come, just when you think you can bear it no more. The blackbirds will come a-calling and a-calling to you. Hearken good, lad, for that'll be the day. And so it had been. They'd sat together by the embers of the fire. The old one had sung at first, gentle, silvery words that Tom had never heard before. The 7 sister stars had shone out in the black sky above the clearing. Gradually, as the sisters turned and set, falling down behind the treetops, the old one's singing ceased. And they sat together in silence. Even the fire was quiet tonight. And as the false green light of the first dawn lit down at the window panes, Tom saw that the old one was gone. He was no longer breathing, and his lips were set in the slight smile. His eyes saw things beyond the cottage walls and would never look on Tom's face again. Tears fell down Tom's cheeks. And Tom had wept as he'd asked the rowan tree for long branches. His tears watered the hazel as he bent to take the twig she'd left for him on the ground. And it was long before he could take the wolf skin from the bed. He spent the time curled within it, sucking on a piece of the old leather like a child. After 3 days, the strength came back to him, and he tied the wolf skin onto the branches, and he tied the old man onto the pallet, and he watched beside the bier all that last night. It was then he noticed how sweet the old man's husk still smelled. Rosemary, he thought, and thyme. As the sun cleared the top of the trees, they arrived at the fountain. All the long path there had been in half-light glimmerings and dapplings as the cold wind shook the last leaves off the trees. The snow had come, as the old man said it would. But the days had been grey and heavy, like a darkling blanket cast across the bowl of the sky. This was not the Robin Winter Tom had always known. This was some great dark beast, hungry and malevolent. No lover of the little lives of the forest. He feared it. The warm wolf fur, when it had finally touched him by the fountain, seemed a last link with the web of life he'd always known. It felt as if the web was breaking up on the old one's death, and the wolf's sweet breath was a last reminder of how life had been. Now, here, walking across the silver sea, he remembered the bright dark eyes smiling to him as the grey paws circled round. Coming out from his inner world, he saw the light had changed. The sea and the sky had changed, all while he'd been off dreaming. The brightness now almost stung his eyes as he brought them back to focus on the world around him. It seemed there was another shore ahead. The moon path led them straight towards it, and the horse shook his head and whickered gently, and Tom heard answering calls from up ahead. As the hooves touched down on the earth again, the apple scent rose up around him. Now he could see the blossom blushing on the trees. And he could see the rosy cheeks of apples too, peeking out from behind the green leaves. The trees carried all the seasons. Tom realized how cold and frozen his body had been during the long ride. The sun was warm, and it was low, and the land smelled of spring as he took a breath. He wondered now when he had breathed last. Flexing his muscles, it seemed as if a film of ice had cracked off him, and the sun's warmth was able to reach him again. And a host of people came towards them. Tom was almost lifted down from the horse's back, so many hands supporting him. His feet unsteady, not remembering what it was they had to do. He stumbled, pitching into the ground, coming up with a handful of earth. Laughing, they took his hands and rubbed them on his cheeks. "Now you are blooded to our land," they cried. The lady kissed the horse's nose before he was led away. She turned to Tom, taking his hand, leading him across the sward towards the cave mouth. Such a cave mouth! Tom saw it fully now she had hold of him again. The cottage and the clearing would be lost within that cave, he thought. You could put a dozen cottages inside and still lose them. There were things like icicles standing up out of the ground and hanging down from the roof, coiled and curled into fantastical shapes, and as they came closer, he could see that some of the largest ones were carved as well. There were dragons and unicorns, griffins and cats, and all manner of beasts and flying creatures he had no name for at all. Passing close, he reached a hand to touch one. Hard it was, and perhaps slippery. He put his finger in his mouth. There was a taste there too, and the lady was laughing. "Just like our home then, Fair Thomas." He did. "So pick me an apple, Thomas," she said, and he reached up to the nearest tree. The apple came easily to his hand. He would have passed her the fruit, but she took it, took his hand, and pulled the apple to her mouth, biting deep, and then she pushed it back to him. "Eat it, Thomas," she laughed. "Eat the fruit of my gardens. It gives the silver tongue and the golden heart." Tom bit deep, the juice running back down his throat. "The like of this I ne'er tasted afore," he gasped, and even in his own ears his voice was changing. They took him to a room within. Again, there was a luminescence flowing out of the walls, lighting the place from within. Peering through an arch in the rock, he saw a great bathing pool steaming, flowers strewn in the water, fresh clothes laid out for him. And the fair folk began stripping him of the weather-beaten clothing he wore, helped him into the bath, rubbed out of him the cold and pain of the journey in the warm, scented water. And later, at the feast, Tom remembered little of the dishes, only that his palate seemed to be sung to by a melody of flowers. His ears fed by tasteful music, his eyes feasting on a symphony of colour and light. The winds blew summer meadow fragrances through the wide halls, spiced with autumn leaves and the smell of earth after rain. The lady took every opportunity to fondle him. And later, in bed, it was the same. The dawn seemed long in coming, and yet it arrived too early for Tom. His heart and soul belonged to the lady. Days passed in pleasure, and when he was not with her, he spent his time with the elves, learning songs and making instruments. And soon he was called upon to play in the great hall of an evening. His fame spread throughout the Seelie courts into the whole of Elfland. And then one day she rose early, and he did not see her all day. In the evening she looked away from him often, but was always ready to catch his eye should he look at her. That night their love burned up brighter than the day star at midsummer. When he awoke, she was gone. Tom wandered through empty halls. All the doors and passages seemed to lead him outside, and from there he found no way to return again within. He sat on a stone where the cave entrance had been, watching the sun rise and fall over the sea. And at evening the horse came to him. A little elven lad came soon after, carrying a small satchel. The horse was bridled for a journey. The elven lad tightened the girths and handed the satchel to Tom. "You must return now. Return to the land of men. You've done your work for us here. The lady is abed with child now." Tom turned about. The bare cliff confronted him, no entry now into the Seelie court. He stood totally bereft. "Oh, come now, Tom. The old one told thee what was needed. He told thee how we were born. Did you think 'twould be any different for 'ee now?" "I never did think." Tom stumbled over the words. "I never did believe. In truth, I wanted to believe there is no pain, there is no loss." "Ah, 'tis so for her too, Tom. The lady grieves for 'ee too. And think ye that's something to look forward to. But for her, 'tis something to lose again. She loses thee now, and later on, she loses the babe as well." Tom stood aghast. He had forgotten. The promise was the same for him as it had been for the old one. 9 nights of pleasure, 9 months of waiting, and 3 times 9 years of companionship. But for her, was it only the 9 nights and the 9 months, and the babe would be gone for her forever? He mounted now up onto the horse's back, and the milk-white steed shook his silvery mane and set off for the shore. Tom never looked back. He had counted the days now, and when the toll was done, he waited in the shadow of the porch. 9 months was gone, and the moon was full again. And he had not slept now for nigh on a week, waiting, watching. Some trick of the light caught his eye as he followed the owl on a hunting path around the edge of the clearing. She flew long and slow tonight, silent wings cupping the air, a fleeting white ghost of shadow. Gwennifer, he breathed the owl's name in the old tongue. And she called, a wild, shrieking cry, like an infant who leaves the safety of his mother's arms for the loneliness of cold stone. And Tom shook his head, the crying ringing in his ears and driving dreams away. And looking down, he saw the white-clad bundle by the doorpost. Crying out, calling to her, he stumbled through the door. In the gloaming at the edge of the forest, he thought he saw the flicker of a silver tail, thought he heard the rhythm of the hooves on the forest path. And then a low branch caught him round the waist, bringing him down. As he fell, his eye lighted on the delicate hoof prints, fading now out of the bright springy turf. Slowly, he made his way back to the cottage, to the whimpering bundle laid on his stone step. He picked up the babe. The eyes opened, seeming like dark forest pools, and he lost himself in their depth. A miniature hand grasped his finger and pulled it into the tiny mouth, sucked hard. Smiling, Tom took the lad inside. Over the following winter, he made the first harp, small enough for the tiny fingers when they were ready to begin their learning. And every night, he sang the songs of Elvenholm to the little one in the cradle. And every morning, he sang new songs of earth and sky, of beast and bird, of plant and rock. And so life went on. Well, that's the rhymer's tale. How Thomas lives and lives and dies and dies, and how the circle of life, the circle between this world and the Tuluteg, goes on and on. Be back soon with another story. But bye for now.